Where did all the controversy and discussion about private, well, put the private aside for a minute. Where did all the controversy and discussion about federal borrowing come from? I mean, where did it all start?
Presidential campaign?
Yes, it's part of presidential politics, but since when? I mean, what's the origin of all this?
30s.
Well, the 1930s. What happened in the 1930s?
The Great Depression.
The Great Depression. And why is the Great Depression an origin of the controversy?
Keynesian economics says that government should actively participate in controlling economic stability, I guess.
Okay, so in other words, in 1936, John Maynard Keynes, an English economist, published a famous book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in which, in the context of the Great Depression, he said that federal budget deficits, that is, federal government expenditures which exceed revenues, would have a stimulating impact on economic activity and therefore reduce massive unemployment. Mass unemployment. Now, in 1960, when President John F. Kennedy was running for office of president, he said that the economy was not growing rapidly enough. And he took the Keynesian, from John Maynard Keynes, he took the Keynesian prescription and said we can apply that today. Even though we're not in the midst of the Great Depression, the economy is not growing rapidly enough, and we should use the Keynesian point of view to stimulate the economy. But, he said, instead of advocating a growth in federal expenditures, more government spending, without increasing taxes, let's do it this way. Let's have a cut in taxes without increasing government spending. In other words, or without reducing government spending, rather. So let me review that and clear up my mistake. Mr. Keynes had said in the 1930s, let's increase government spending without raising taxes. If you increase government spending without raising taxes, private consumption isn't going to fall. Federal spending will increase, total spending will rise. Mr. Kennedy said, let's cut taxes, that'll get private consumption increase. We won't cut government spending, and so all there will be an increase in private consumption due to the cut in taxes. There'll be no cut in government spending, therefore total spending will rise and the economy will be stimulated. Interestingly, in the United States Senate, Republicans objected. They said it would be fiscally irresponsible. That is, it would lead to deficits. In other words, cut taxes without cutting spending, more deficits. Well, President Kennedy could not get his measure through Congress. He was assassinated in 1963. And then President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson had been President Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson became president, and he said, let's go forward with Mr. Kennedy's proposal, President Kennedy's proposal, and in the surge of goodwill that arose following the assassination, Congress passed the tax cut. The economy surged. And the economy did so well that everybody said, yes, the tax cuts worked. They stimulated total demand because we cut taxes without cutting government spending. As a result, private spending rose, consumption rose, federal spending didn't fall, total spending increased. They worked great. President Nixon, even though he was a Republican, and even though once upon a time the Republicans had challenged Mr. Kennedy's proposed tax cut as being fiscally irresponsible, that is generating a deficit, President Nixon, who was a Republican, said, we are all Keynesians now. And he advocated a tax cut in 1970, went forward. In 1975, President Ford advocated a tax cut to deal with the recession. No objections. Now, things began to change. In the late 70s, inflation surged. We talked about that. And a new view arose called supply-side economics. And the supply-side economists said, look, forget about aggregate demand. Focus on aggregate supply. Inflation is rampant. People's incomes hardly keep up with inflation. Yet as their incomes rise, they get pushed into higher tax brackets. There was a steeply progressive tax at the time. And as a result, they pay more in taxes. And when people pay more in taxes, that reduces their incentive to work. It reduces their saving. It cuts back on total supply. So what we ought to have, the supply-side economists say, in order to stimulate the economy, in order to stimulate aggregate supply, is a tax cut. Not to stimulate demand, but to stimulate supply. Along comes Ronald Reagan, former governor of California. He runs for president in 1980. He picks up the mantra of supply-side economics, advocates it as his own, and the result is when he is elected, he proposes to Congress a massive tax cut to stimulate aggregate supply. That's the one we pointed out when we had an image on the screen. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. Here's President Kennedy advocating a tax cut to stimulate demand. Here's President Reagan advocating a tax cut to stimulate supply. What's the difference? How can you call one demand side, how can you call one supply side? Because President Kennedy advocated a tax cut for the lower income earners, President Reagan for the upper income earners. And President Reagan said, here's how it's going to work. One, by cutting taxes for the upper income earners, the movers and shakers, it'll give them more incentive to work hard. Two, the upper income earners are the savers. There'll be more saving, more investment, more production. Congress voted yes eventually, even though the Democrats this time objected. Just like 20 years earlier, the Republicans had objected to the Democrats' tax cut. Now the Democrats objected to the Republican tax cut. Eventually the tax cut went through. And there was, as you can see, a massive deficit. And there's still a debate going on as to whether or not aggregate supply was stimulated or not. In my view, the main effect of policy during the 80s was mainly the Federal Reserve's policy bringing down the rate of inflation with the big increase in interest rates, which we had talked about earlier. I think that was more important than anything else. Nonetheless, we get to 1990, 1992. Who's running for president in 1992? Who is president? Who's the incumbent in 1992? George Bush Sr. Bill Clinton is a Democratic candidate, but then there's Ross Perot as an independent. Ross Perot focuses on the budget deficit. Looking at 1992, you can see they're pretty big. at the time.